The night Justin Rutter disappeared didn't feel like the beginning of anything. There was no storm, no argument, no warning, just a quiet October evening in 2009 in a part of Ottawa where the streets carried stories most people never heard. Lower Town wasn't the kind of place that made headlines, but it was the kind of place where things could happen without anyone asking too many questions. Justin was 14 years old. He wasn't big. He wasn't loud. He wasn't the kind of kid who demanded attention when he walked into a room. At just over 5 feet tall, thin, almost fragile, he looked younger than he actually was. The kind of teenager who could disappear in a crowd even when he wasn't trying. But there was one thing about him that stood out. 3 small moles on his right cheek, forming a near-perfect triangle. A detail so precise that investigators would later call it a biometric signature. Something that wouldn't change with time. Something that, in theory, made him impossible to completely erase. That night, Justin left his house like it was nothing. No bag, no money, no plan, just a decision. At least, that's what it looked like. When his mother woke up the next morning and saw his bed untouched, there was no confusion in her mind. No hesitation. No assumption that he was at a friend's house or that he'd be back soon. She knew something was wrong. Not later. Not eventually. Immediately. Because Justin had never done this before. Not once. He wasn't a runaway. He wasn't rebellious. He wasn't unpredictable. He had routines, habits, patterns, and disappearing overnight didn't fit into any of them. But by the time the police got involved, the story had already begun to shift. Because someone said something, a friend, a simple sentence that would change everything. He said he didn't want to go home. That was it. That was enough. Enough for the police to label him a runaway. Enough to slow everything down. Enough to turn urgency into procedure. And in missing person cases, that kind of delay can be fatal. Because the first 48 hours aren't just important. They're everything. That's when memories are fresh, when sightings are reliable, when evidence still exists in the places it was left behind. But instead of treating Justin like a child in danger, the system treated him like a teenager making a choice. And choices don't trigger alarms. Choices don't justify large-scale searches. Choices don't get the same attention. So while the clock was ticking, the response stayed measured, controlled, normal. But nothing about Justin's situation was normal. The last confirmed sighting placed him about 5 kilometers from home, near the intersection of Cote Street and St. Laurent Boulevard. It was late, dark, the kind of place where movement blends into shadow. He was seen talking to someone, a friend, according to reports, and he repeated the same thing. He didn't want to go home. At face value, it sounded like teenage defiance, the kind of statement that gets shrugged off. But context changes everything, because a 14-year-old, alone, at night, far from home, isn't just making a decision. He's taking a risk, and risk, in the wrong environment, doesn't stay small for long. Lower Town and Vanier weren't just neighborhoods on a map. In 2009, they were ecosystems, places where poverty, instability, and street economies overlapped in ways that created invisible dangers. For adults, those dangers could be managed. For a 14-year-old boy, they could be overwhelming. And then 6 days passed. 6 days with no confirmed contact. 6 days of uncertainty stretching longer with every hour. Until something happened. On October 14th, witnesses came forward. Multiple people claimed they had seen Justin, alive, walking in Vanier, talking to people, moving through the area like nothing had happened. At first, it felt like a breakthrough. Hope returned, because if Justin was alive 6 days later, it meant he had survived. It meant he'd found a way. It meant there was still time. Police initially confirmed the sighting. And just like that, the entire direction of the case shifted. Because this wasn't a missing child anymore. This was a runaway who was still out there by choice. But there was a detail that didn't fit. A small detail. The kind of detail that changes everything if you pay attention to it. Justin had changed clothes. The brown and white sweatshirt he wore the night he disappeared was gone. In its place, witnesses described a white hoodie. At first, it might seem insignificant. People change clothes all the time. But Justin had no money, no bank account, no resources. So how does a 14-year-old survive nearly a week on streets? And somehow replace his clothes? There are only a few possible answers. Someone gave them to him, which means someone was with him, helping him, feeding him, protecting him, or controlling him. And that's where the story takes a darker turn. Because a child doesn't just survive on the streets alone for 6 days without interacting with someone. And not everyone who helps has good intentions. Vanier at the time had its own rules, its own systems, its own way of operating outside the structure of the city. Information didn't flow freely. Trust wasn't automatic, and silence had value. If Justin was moving through that environment, he wasn't invisible. Someone saw him. Someone spoke to him. Someone knew where he went next. But no one came forward. Or if they did, they didn't say enough. Because after that day, everything stopped. No more sightings. No more reports. No more movement. It was as if Justin had stepped into that neighborhood and never stepped out. At first, people held on to the idea that he would come back, that he would get tired, that he would run out of options. Because that's what usually happens. Runaways return. They call home. They get picked up for something small. They show up somewhere. They exist. But Justin didn't. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. And then into years. And still nothing. No bank activity. No medical records. No identification use. No trace in any system. Living completely off the grid isn't impossible. But it's not something a 14-year-old can do without help. Long-term help. Organized help. And the more time passed, the less likely that became. Because maintaining that kind of invisibility comes with a cost. Food, shelter, safety, those things aren't free. Someone pays for them. And if Justin wasn't paying, someone else was. Which raises a question that still hasn't been answered. Why? Why would someone invest in keeping a 14-year-old hidden? Unless they weren't helping him survive. They were making sure he wouldn't be found. By the time 5 years had passed, the illusion had completely collapsed. There was no more pretending. No more theories about adventure or rebellion or temporary escape. Because 5 years without a trace doesn't mean someone is hiding. It means something went wrong. In 2014, investigators finally said it out loud. For the first time, authorities publicly acknowledged what Justin's family had known from the beginning. This was likely a criminal case. Not a runaway. Not a misunderstanding. A crime. But by then, the damage was already done. Time had moved forward. And time doesn't just pass in cases like this. It erases. Witnesses forget details. Locations change. Buildings are demolished, rebuilt, repurposed. Evidence disappears without anyone realizing it was ever there. If something had happened to Justin in those early hours, the best chance to find answers was already gone. Still, the investigation continued. Slowly, quietly, carefully, because even without evidence, patterns can still emerge. One of those patterns led investigators thousands of kilometers away, to Vancouver. It's something investigators sometimes call westward drift, a phenomenon where missing youth end up on the West Coast, drawn by the promise of anonymity, community, and survival. For a moment, it made sense. If Justin had managed to leave Ottawa, if he had found help, if he had built a new identity, Vancouver would be a place to do it. The theory offered something rare. Hope, because it meant Justin might still be alive, living under a different name, disconnected from his past, but alive. Investigators followed the lead. They coordinated with local authorities. They checked records, interviewed people, searched for any sign that Justin had made it there. They found nothing. Not a single piece of evidence connecting him to the city. No sightings, no records, no confirmation. The theory dissolved, and with it, another layer of hope disappeared. What remained was far more unsettling, because if Justin never left Ottawa, then whatever happened to him happened close to home, in familiar streets, near people who might still be there, people who might still remember, people who might still be silent. And silence, in cases like this, isn't empty. It's active. It protects something, or someone. Over time, another issue began to surface. Not about evidence, but about value. In many investigations, information is bought. Not officially, but practically. Rewards are offered, money in exchange for truth. Because in environments where speaking up carries risk, people need a reason to take that risk. In Justin's case, that reward was set at $5,000, and it stayed there, year after year. While in other cases, similar cases, rewards climbed much higher. $50,000, $75,000, sometimes more. The difference wasn't just financial. It was symbolic. It sent a message, whether intentional or not, that this case wasn't being valued the same way. And in places where information is currency, low value doesn't buy silence, but it doesn't break it either. So the silence held. 15 years passed. 15 years of waiting, of not knowing, of living in a space where there is no conclusion, no closure, just absence. In 2024, investigators made another attempt. They released a new image, an age progression, a projection of what Justin might look like at 29 years old. The image was detailed, carefully constructed, based on genetics, growth patterns, probability. The face was older, sharper, more defined, but one thing remained exactly the same. The 3 moles on his right cheek. That triangle, that signature. Because no matter how much time passes, some things don't change. It was a reminder that if Justin was still alive, he could still be recognized, anywhere, by anyone. But it was also something else. A confrontation, a way of saying that the case wasn't gone, that it hadn't been forgotten, that somewhere someone might look at that face and realize something, remember something, or feel something they have been avoiding for years. Because in cases like this, the truth doesn't disappear. It gets buried, under fear, under time, under choices people made and never admitted. And sometimes it stays there, not because it's impossible to find, but because no one is willing to uncover it. The reality is simple. Someone knows what happened. Maybe they didn't mean for it to go that far. Maybe it started as something small, a conversation, an offer, a moment, and then something changed, something escalated, something irreversible, or maybe it was intentional from the start. A target, an opportunity, a decision made in seconds that destroyed a life. Either way, the result is the same. A boy walked out of his house and never came back. No trace, no evidence, no answers, just a timeline that ends in silence. And a question that refuses to go away. What happened after that last sighting? After the conversation? After the change of clothes? After the moment where Justin was still visible? Because somewhere between that moment and everything that followed, something ended. And whatever it was final. That's what makes this case different. Not just the disappearance, but the completeness of it. The absence of mistakes. The lack of evidence. The total disappearance of a human being in a modern city. In a world where cameras exist, records exist, systems exist, Justin Rutter became invisible. And invisibility doesn't happen by accident. It happens when something or someone makes sure of it. So the question isn't just where Justin is. It's what kind of event can erase someone so completely that 15 years later, we're still asking the same question and getting no answer because the truth is still out there. Not lost, not gone, just waiting for the one moment when silence finally breaks. Subscribe for more.